Well, because the more specified exponent is irrelevant in the competition now. Because the terminal node doesn't have the features that it had on the way to the syntax. That is to say, remember we thought about the syntax takes an envelope and sends it to the exponent list, and the exponent list just carefully takes out a little accountant, takes out the thing, and pastes on phonology and pieces on the tree. Well, that envelope was hijacked along the way. That envelope was hijacked along the way, and it was hijacked by a morphotactician who implemented this rule and said, get rid of those person features in this configuration. By the time it got to the exponent list had a simple computation to do. It inserted that because that was the only thing possible. Do you guys understand? Questions? Want to make sure you understand, so ask questions in any way, shape, or form that would help you.
The same account explains he don't like.
Okay, good. So then we have a question about dialects that say things like he don't like rainy days. Okay, now the interesting question there is, in dialects that say he don't like rainy days, do we have, okay, so I presume what's behind your question is the intuition that similarly we have things like, we have the vocabulary items do for first person, yeah, do for second person, does for third person, do, and then in negation we have don't, doesn't, don't. Right? Are you all in agreement? So here it's very obvious that don't is the elsewhere item because it's got the most heterogeneous distribution. It's used basically everywhere except for third person singular. But suddenly some people are using it even for third person singular. Now one option is to say, well, those people simply don't have does. But if the same individual says does, says he does, but he don't, then we can't say that that person doesn't possess does. We're saying that something in this specific environment is removing does, but only in the presence of negation. So yes, I would say, the simpler case to deal with would be the individuals who have the type of dialect which is described for English, which is one that has was used in affirmative contexts, but weren't used in negative contexts. Like I had just talked about Tahani. Yeah. So these dialects do make a distinction, for example, between singular and plural. In the affirmative, they say I was, he was, but then in negation, they say I weren't, he weren't. So there seems to be this kind of morpho... And in fact, the existence of exactly what you're talking about suggests that this rule of ament is not phonological. Because it doesn't care about am. It seems to be something that's happening more generally with auxiliaries in the presence of negation, that in the presence of negation, less specified forms of auxiliaries are popping up. Elsewhere forms of auxiliaries that we don't expect to be used are suddenly jokers, are suddenly popping up in the presence of negation. One way to understand that clearly is to say that negation is somehow causing a morphotactic problem, or at least putting on some morphotactic pressure, such that the rich amount of features we'd expect to see on the auxiliary are getting deleted and don't have a chance to be exponed by more specific exponents. Very good. Now, you have a question?
Do you know if that's the case in other languages with things with negation?
It's quite general that you find what you might say is a poorer or less, fully expressed set of inflectional possibilities in the presence of negation, specifically when negation seems to be forming part of the same word. It's not that negation anywhere in the sentence will cause that, but it's something about having negation on the same word. So in order to find such cases, we need to find languages or examples where negation specifically co-occurs as part of the same word. Now, the question, though, might be, why negation? And the answer to that I'd like to start to introduce and motivate is the notion that negation has a kind of markedness to it. Now, what is markedness? Okay, markedness is a difficult notion for many people at first sight. Markedness, very simply speaking, says if you have two opposites, they're not treated as just symmetric opposites. Okay, I have red and blue. Well, those are red and green, whatever you like. You might say day and night, or whatever. No, those are not left and right. Those are not treated as opposites. One of those is treated differently than the other. One of those is treated as more of a default, if you like, than the other. So, you take the case of handedness, right? We might say left and right, well, those are just opposites. Well, no, it seems like in, at least, Homo sapiens, that left-handedness is more marked than right-handedness. Now, what does that mean? You might say, well, that just means that it is less common. But that's not quite all of it, right? Because left-handedness is not just less common. In fact, there are all kinds of interesting properties about handedness that correlate with it. It's not just it's less common, of course, and saying it's less common doesn't tell us anything about why. Why? Okay, it's less common. Why is it less common, right? So, yeah. So, but as a first approximation, I think that can be a useful intuition to say, well, yeah, okay. Left-handedness is more marked, and indeed, it's less common. But I don't want to emphasize it about being more or less common. I want to say that the difference between left-handed and right-handed is asymmetric. They're not treated as two equally opposite. It's not like heads and tails of a coin. They're not equally opposite. And some people would say that handedness exists in organisms specifically because you don't want it to be 50-50. One of the main theories out there about handedness says that handedness comes from animals that were chased by predators. And if you have a predator that's chasing a set of pack animals, this is not my theory, but computer simulations show this to be true, that if you have a predator that's chasing a set of pack animals, if suddenly 30% of them go to the left or to the right, the predator will go for those. It's maybe easier to chase a smaller group than a bigger group because it's easier to hone in. Don't ask me about the details, okay? But there are theories that are out there say that there's a specific ratio, and if it were just 50-50, there would be no advantage to handedness. The predator would just choose one side and that would be that. But that it specifically comes from cases where, the population as a whole will survive better because, predator may go for one set than others. There's also another theory of handedness that says that it is beneficial to be left-handed because of pugilism. When people box, if you're left-handed, you're actually a better boxer than right-handed people because they're not used to boxing with left-handed people. Well, if the population was 50-50, there would be no advantage for lefties. So, specifically something that survives because it's less than 50%. Anyway, the point is that if we start to think about the various theories that are out there for left-handedness, and by the way, this kind of lateral specialization even goes down to bees, who have one antenna that's longer than the other and more sensitive than the other, and to dogs, who apparently wag their tail when they see their owner more in one direction than the other. So, there is this asymmetric lateralization is very deep in the animal kingdom. So left-handedness, it seems to be, it may be a good example, maybe a bad example, but it's a manifestation that I want to use to introduce this notion of markedness, that, plus and minus are not always equally treated by the grammar. And so it's specifically that in the case of negation, negation is treated differently by the grammar than affirmation. And negation, when things are marked, what that will mean for us is that they sometimes cause morphotactic problems. They induce morphotactic pressure. So specifically, that when you have negation on the same M word as something else, that will add to the overall markedness cost, if you like, of that word. Yeah, the same way that this is the part you'll have to edit.
Yeah, it's fine. You can cut this out. We're going to have a little interlude, tea break.
The same way. Yeah. Okay. I think I have an example. I think I have an example. Okay. So in general, we know that given the two diphthongs in English, I and ow, I is more common than ow. Okay, this is a bit of a digression, but I hope you'll find it interesting. If we look at I and ow in English, we find that I and ow differ in the following sense. I is a better diphthong than ow. And the reason for that, according to me, the people, what I want to specifically talk about here, is the fact that actually E and oo, we call those both high vowels, right? But they actually don't quite have the same height. We might say that oo is a little bit lower in the vowel space than E. Now, if one principle that governs diphthongs is having them as well spaced as possible, yeah? Ideally, you want the two halves of your diphthong to be as far apart from each other as possible. Then I is going to be a better diphthong than ow because the distance between I and E is slightly greater than the distance between I and oo. Okay? So again, seeing I and ow, we might say, one's a front off glide, one's a back off glide. Same. But we might say, no, ow is more marked as a diphthong. More marked because of these reasons. Okay? So far, so good? Now, here's the interesting thing. So this thing is more marked. What evidence might we see for that? Well, it turns out that it being more marked plays a role in how it behaves in combinations. And we can have words, when we start combining, we can have words like ibe all over the place. Vibe, jibe, yeah? Or with an M, time, dime, rhyme. But we can't do that with B. We can't do that here. There are no words in English like town or raub. Those words just don't exist. Okay? You following along? So that's kind of like what I want to say about negation. The diphthong I exists, the diphthong ow exists. But for independent reasons, we might think that the diphthong ow is more marked than the diphthong I. And that markedness of it will have the consequence that it allows it to combine with less stuff. So that both of them can combine with coronals, and you can get right and route, and you can get town, and